Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Welcome to the next part in my ongoing 12-part series of Tier 1 Roundup, where I'm listening to all these albums at the beginning of the year. These are going to set the stage for everything I listen to for the rest of the year. At the core of this post lies jazz, but each of these artists take a different take on it, sometimes through the lens of a different cultural background, or maybe through just a different approach to jazz, but ultimately all these albums rotate around that center. Starting off with Mulatu Astatake, Mulatu of Ethiopia. Mulatu of Ethiopia stands as a defining work not only for Mulatu Astatake, the musician, but also for the genre of Ethio jazz. Up to this point, Mulatu had been working with different kinds of combinations of Ethiopian traditional music and Latin music and jazz, and had up to that point been calling it Afro-Latin jazz. But on this album, he claims it as Ethio jazz, which became as important of a discovery to Eastern African pop music as Afrobeat was to Western African pop music. Now, as closely tied as Ethio jazz is to traditional Ethiopian musical standards, Mulatu of Ethiopia was actually recorded in the U.S., in New York City, shortly after Mulatu Astatake had spent some time in Berkeley studying and developing his ideas that he was going to apply to Ethio jazz. So even though he was trying to preserve Ethiopian music in the making of Mulatu of Ethiopia, due to where he was whenever he made the recording, he had to use Western musicians. The recording was made in New York City, and he had to use session musicians to make these recordings happen. Even though Western session musicians are very flexible and able to take on lots of different styles of music as part of their job, Mulatu spent weeks and weeks with these session musicians working on trying to get the feel of these songs right. And I think that's actually pretty important because the melodic conventions that you hear in Ethio jazz are derived from Ethiopian traditional modes. And a lot of those modes are very ornamented, and as they're also very connected to Persian styles, they're supposed to kind of evoke a mood. You know, you think about Indian music and a certain raga is supposed to evoke a mood. These are the sorts of things that's very difficult to translate across cultural barriers. So Mulatu spent a lot of time trying to get this feel right. You know, you have these melodies that are very, very active, and a lot of that activity is a reflection of the sort of highly ornamented melodic conventions that are often associated with modal styles. And to my ears, his investment was very successful because Mulatu of Ethiopia, like a lot of Ethio jazz, is very dark and very atmospheric and borders on the hypnotic. Vibraphones kind of hover in the mix, creating this sort of like cinematic shadows that are very Lynchian in nature and that they're very dark and liminal. Yet the album really never loses its groove. It still propels itself along and has this loping, relaxed feel despite the activity of the melodies and this sort of juxtaposition that I think makes Ethio jazz so fascinating. And this album was kind of ground zero for the conventions that would push that style forward, as it preserved lineage while quietly creating something new. Next up I got Fela Kuti and the Africa 70 live with Ginger Baker. In 1971, Ginger Baker had a pretty good idea of the gravity associated with his name. Cream had broken up several years before, but as a players band, people were interested in what was going on with the musicians that were involved with the group. In those years after Cream broke up, he quite famously spent a bit of time traveling across Africa, and he met at that time Fela Kuti, and they'd known each other for several years by this point. So it was his intention to bring Fela up to Abbey Road Studios and do a couple of recording sessions. The first of those recording sessions produced the album Aphrodisiac. The second one was this one. And this isn't really a live album in the way that you normally would think of it. This isn't like Fela sitting up in the middle of a big auditorium and playing. This is actually live in the studio. They had made special arrangements in Abbey Road to accommodate a studio audience and changed the space in the monitoring room to make space for everything. And to be honest, the recording sounds a lot like a lot of Fela's other albums. The sound quality is pretty good. And the fact of the matter is, most of Fela's albums were recorded in kind of what we would consider a live setting. We're not talking about studio separation or anything like that. He set up all the stuff, his whole Africa 70, live in a room and recorded. This is a natural environment for him to perform in. It just had the added benefit of being able to play off of the crowd. And because of Fela's very unique charisma, this really made for a good setting for him. Fela's recordings are almost always energetic, but this one really does have a lot of life to it because I think of that close quarters studio setting that they were performing in. If you want to argue for an existence of an alpha male personality, Fela, I think, would be a primary example for you because He's one of the few people I think that could tame Ginger Baker. Ginger Baker was known for being, at the very least, a difficult guy to work with, but very often he could back it up. He's a really great player, especially at the time, very innovative guy who was able to cross over jazz chops with rock chops. If you're familiar with the general feel of what Afrobeat does, especially as it was rendered by the Africa 70, you can definitely hear there's a little bit more emphasis on 2 and 4, like a standard rock beat, but you really have to kind of dig to find that. For the most part, Ginger Baker fits in with the group pretty well, but it's also very telling when Ginger Baker takes a solo section on this one and Fela at one point tell him to stop. It's too much. You've gone too far. And then turns to the crowd and says, Ginger Baker will do whatever I say. Not many people could get away with that with Ginger Baker, and I think there was enough of a mutual respect and also Ginger Baker understanding that he was trying to put Fela up in front to raise his visibility to a wider audience and for once kind of getting his own ego out of the way a little bit. But aside from those couple of instances, the only spot where you can really hear Ginger Baker kind of take off is this 15-minute bonus track at the end. It's a drum solo between him and Tony Allen and the rest of the Africa 70. And it's really cool to hear him do these interactions because you'll hear him actually interact with talking drummers, and Tony Allen, whose approach to the drums is completely different. And as a member of Africa 70 is the guy that is used to holding it together on his own. So it really shows the inclusive nature, I think, of African music in general, whose structure is so radically different than a lot of Western music. Next I got Tortoise Touch. Tortoise is usually categorized as a post-rock band. They've been around for decades, and they've taken about 9 years off since their last album. But this newer album of theirs is definitely, I think, continues in the Tortoise tradition. It certainly sounds like Tortoise normally always sounds like. But there's a level, I think, of restraint on this album, especially melodically from some of their earlier work. Melodies aren't quite as prominent as I've heard from their previous work. But in some ways, that's allowed a little bit of negative space to open up in Tortoise's sound and given them a little bit more of a cinematic scope, I think, even more so than they've already have achieved in the past. You know, when you start talking about things being post-rock, that's a problematic term, I think, because it's just so broad. The intent is kind of like rock music that breaks boundaries, but it's not progressive rock. It's not one of those things. So Tortoise kind of falls into this crack because they're difficult to define. I've always felt like, and I feel like stronger on this album than before, that they're really in some ways kind of a jazz fusion group. But when you put that label on them, you start associating them with things like, you know, the Mahavishnu Orchestra or Return to Forever. Tortoise doesn't get into that sort of showboating or egocentric playing. Instead, there's a lot of restraint and a lot of groove that goes along with what they're doing. They really push things along with these very colorful and grandiose grooves that really open up to a sense of wonder. Not to say, of course, that Tortoise's music and touch is not complex. It is. It's just not in terms of density or speed. It's more in terms of like how parts interlock and breathe and evolve over time. The mood of this album is set a lot by vibraphone. Again, not unlike that Mulatu album that we were talking about earlier. But here, of course, as is often the case with Tortoise albums, acoustic sounds are tempered by a lot of electronic effects that broaden the sonic palette of the album to, again, cinematic levels. So I would say that Touch doesn't really sound like a comeback or a reinvention. Instead, I think it deepens the band's language. And by pulling back a little bit on usual melodic emphasis, gives them the opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into other aspects of their sound and develop that, which allows them to show how grooves can hold time and restraint can invite immersion. And finally, I got the next, Disquiet. Disquiet is a massive proposition. We're talking about a 3-disc set, and each disc holds over an hour's worth of music. Its sheer length alone makes it a difficult listen, but not because the music is in any way abrasive, but because it demands patience, attention, and a willingness to submit to the immersive aspects of what they're doing. Now, in spite of its length and its sort of daunting scope, Disquiet actually remains endlessly interesting as you're listening to it. The music is constructed around these ostinatos that go on over the course of each track, an hour long. And there's situations where that kind of insistent ostinato can beat a track down, allow the tension to become almost too much to bear. But what keeps the tracks from falling into that trap is little organic micro variations. The next are essentially a jazz piano trio, and they, rather than having huge kinds of improvisational grand sweeps, it's these small changes that they make over the course of any track, and they evolve. Even though the ends of the track sounds very similar to the beginning, there's changes in the middle that allow it to be soothing but not boring over the course of the whole time you're listening to it. The songs don't resist development. They invite human interaction and the natural evolution that happens when minds set themselves to that environment. Now, the most immediate label you might be able to put on this is to call it ambient jazz, but it also is a little bit too restless to really fit well into that category. Last year we listened to Nala Snefro, and I've been listening to Alice Coltrane recently. These are a little bit more serene in their realization of this style of jazz. But the pieces on Disquiet have this underlying tension that ripples below the surface that kind of keeps things agitated like water that's about to boil all the time. So there is changes throughout the course of each of these tracks, but it's never abrupt. So as a result, the listener can listen to the beginning of a song, and then their attention can go elsewhere, maybe work or something else, and then come back in the middle of it and still hear where they are, still drop the needle in the middle of the song and hear where they've come from and where they're going, but in the process can also still sink into it and listen to those micro variations, listen to how things unfold in a more engaging way with the immersion that this music asks for. This is an album that rewards patience not with catharsis but with depth. It's a reminder that repetition, when handled with care, can carry extraordinary weight. And that's all I got for you guys this time around. So if you like this video, please like and subscribe and share it with your friends. Also, follow me over on Spotify. I'm going to put a next track on there too, so you better go get a cup of coffee for that one. And if you want to be part of my Viewer's Choice Top 20 discourse throughout the course of the year, helping me decide what the best albums I listen to this year will be, please sign up for my Patreon below. And until you see you next time, I'll catch you guys on the flip side.